we will hear as well, on the flip side about risk is there's some really heartening pieces happening. Many organizations are getting better at this, is helping young people who feel so disconnected from their histories, their cultures, and their families and communities. Helping young people reclaim that, engaging with elders, is finding pathways to engage with their culture of origin, exploring identity, sense of self through art and stories and histories, and there's a reclaiming that can happen there that I think can be quite powerful. I think the kind of backing up a little bit to my discussion about what homelessness means. And I've written a decent amount about this, is there's something that happens to one's self-concept or the identities one has when one becomes street involved and experiences homelessness. And there can be some losses of sense of self, a heavy imposition of identities, stigmatized, discriminatory identities that individual system services apply, that it's impossible not for a person to not take some of that on, and that has a major impact on people's sense of self-worth and self-efficacy. A lot happens there. So a lot of the path out and the path towards survival and resilience, it has to do, I think, with self-concept and building a different self-concept that pushes against those stigmatizing messages and identities, reclaims identity from perhaps some really terrible experiences as a child and young person, and reshaping and forming and coming up with some different senses of self. And for Indigenous identifying young people, identifying with their cultures of origin can be a powerful tool in that effort, just as for other young people in other cultures, it can be the same thing can happen there as well. Yeah, and then the last thing I might say is just, and this is cross-cutting, is this should be something people think about when a person experiences. This can be both in the direction of identities of resilience, but also then challenge. I mentioned discrimination, and we know that there are big inequities in our society. As much as we might think that Canada is a good place in many ways and safe, and these ideas are out there. At the same time, there are many people that don't experience our environments here as safe or good, particularly, who experience various forms of discrimination. It can be discrimination based on sexual identity, gender broadly. Young women face many greater risks surrounding homelessness, for example, across the board than young men. And of course, non-gender binary identifying folks and transgender identifying people, two-spirit, and many different identities that face different forms of discrimination and histories of discrimination. And of course, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis young people face discrimination, forms of discrimination, a range of discriminations historically and at present based on those identities. And I guess what I'm getting at here is, for a young person on the streets, we can kind of get thinking a little bit too binary. Is you're stigmatized or discriminated against because you're a young woman or a non-binary identifying person, or as a young Mohawk identifying First Nations youth. But these forms of discrimination intersect or kind of happen, they come together. It's all one package because we're not all one thing or the other. So Indigenous identifying young people face those same intersections of discrimination that are arguably and are more impactful than they might be for a young person who is not visibly from a racialized population or identifies white European origin, identifies as straight, whatever it might be. But Indigenous young people face some unique forms of discrimination across the board, and that's another thing that comes up. And again, it's all kind of, it layers on as well. Is if they're, for example, a First Nations youth who also identifies as two-spirit but not straight, perhaps a young woman or a young trans person. Whatever the pieces are there, they present unique challenges depending on a given context. So I'll stop there. But those are the kinds of things I think that are important to think through, as well as just the really general point is that to really understand these issues well, and to with some authority, the best thing to do is to not listen to people like me talk about it as a white male. I think that this is where there's some great resources to connect in on, some great people with some wonderful wisdom to draw on, and and to talk to young people. You know, I spent many hours out on street environments in the United States and Canada talking to many young people. Um, these are conversations that anyone can have. Is given a person a buck if they're panhandling or coffee or something, you can have a chat. It's not necessarily an interview about their lives, but you can get to know people a little bit because there are folks experiencing this in a lot of neighborhoods, and many, not all, but many will welcome a chat with somebody, so they're not seen as sort of a faceless person on the sidewalk, but you get to know people's names and have some conversations here and there. Anyone can do this, not just researchers.